So for most of my life, I can remember being driven and motivated by guilt and shame. If I did something wrong, if I made a mistake, I would just beat myself up about it and all of that. And I know that I'm not alone in it. One time when I was maybe in first or second grade, I stayed overnight at my cousin Liz's house. And my cousin Liz and my aunt and uncle, they were like the cool cousins that you could hang out with. Their parents let them do more things than my parents did. So I loved staying overnight at my cousin Liz's house. My whole family, we stayed overnight. We were in the middle of a trip. And my cousin and my aunt, they had bought this giant bag of pixie sticks. And I was over the moon because my parents limited these things, this sugar. And so we ate so many of these pixie sticks, my cousin Liz and I. And we had these great sugar buzz. And then when I left the next morning, I wanted more of those sugar sweets that I would only get at my cousin's house. And so I took the rest of the bag from my cousin's house and I stuck them in my backpack. My family, we all loaded into the van and we said goodbye to our cousins and we went down the road a little bit farther. And then I sneakily reached my hand into my backpack and tried to eat another pixie stick, another little fix of sugar there in the car ride. But then my brother, he saw me trying to sneak this pixie stick and he looked at me and he said, "Where did you get that?" And then he stared into my backpack and saw that I had taken the entire leftover bag of sugary goodness. And so he ratted me out in front of my parents. And my parents then, they said, "Where'd you get this whole bag?" And I said, "I took it from my cousin Liz." My parents, they laid into me and they started lecturing me about stealing from my cousin and about too much sugar. And then my tears, they just started to flow. And it was such a moment for me that my dad actually turned the van around and we drove 15 minutes back to my cousin's house. And they made me get out of the car with the stolen bag of pixie sticks and go knock on the door and return them to my cousin. These pipettes of temptation going back to my cousin in her home. And I cried when I handed them back to her. And she said, "It's okay. You could have kept them." And I'm like, "No, it's a really big deal going on in the van over there." And then I turned and I could see my parents staring at me from the van. And I was crying and I walked in my shame back to my family in the car. And it was quiet for about the next couple of hours. Now, this is like one of those really goofy childhood stories, but here's the real truth of it. Throughout my childhood, I felt shame about this experience that I had, the stolen pixie stick experience. My parents, they're good people. They were trying to teach me about integrity and about making sure I ask for things and about, taking care of my body, making sure that I don't have too much sugar. And I don't fault my parents for how they handled that situation. But the way that I internalized it, for me, I would wake up at night just convinced that I was a horrible person because I had stolen the pixie sticks. I was a horrible person who did horrible, horrible things, that I was a thief. I labeled myself with all of these things. So today I want to talk honestly with you about shame. I've done worse things in my life than just lifting a bunch of sugar from my cousin. And I think it's probably true for most of you as well. There have been things that I have done in my life that have left me feeling unworthy, unlovable, like I was a mistake and not good enough and small and stupid and terrible. Shame is this thing that happens that when we screw up and instead of saying to ourselves, "I made a mistake," instead we say to ourselves, "I am a mistake." It's how we internalize that screw up. Do we feel guilt where we say, "Yeah, I made a mistake and I'm going to try and do better"? Or do we internalize it and say, "I am a mistake"? We shame ourselves and we shame other people. And so many of us have actually been the victims of other people's shame. When we screw up or something, we start to hear this litany in our own head, or sometimes we hear a barrage of things from another person about how we're never going to ever measure up, that we'll never be good enough. So we just live and dwell in our shame. And I think so sadly, in so many ways, the church has actually reinforced this idea. For so much of church history, the church seems to start at Genesis chapter 3. Where Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden and God tells Adam and Eve to not eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, but then the serpent convinces Eve and then she does take the fruit, she gives it to Adam, and then God gets super mad and boom, shame, the fall of humanity and all of that. But what I think that we miss most of the story if we start in chapter 3. There are 2 chapters before that where God talks about who humans are, where God says we are going to make humans in our image. And then God does the most crazy thing ever. God calls us good. The truth of us is not the fall, not chapter 3. The truth of us is in chapters 1 and 2. That's the beginning. We are made good and we are made in the image of God. And then thousands of years later, and Jesus comes along and Jesus returns us to that Eden state, reminding us that forever, that nothing will be able to ever separate us from God. There's no gap between you and your goodness. There's no gap between you and your Creator. That is gone forevermore. There is no news that is so good in my life that I can't possibly but want to share that with other people. This news, I think, is so good for some of us that it's hard for us to actually believe it. I think the church is freaked out a little bit about it. And they're afraid if people feel too good about themselves, if people release themselves from their shame, then we can't control their behavior. But for those of us who have walked in shame, we want to be freed of it, and we want to offer that freedom to other people. So I think in the church, unfortunately, it's been reinforced in fear again, that if you'll take your freedom too wildly, if you believe in it, so we better stick with shame because we feel like we can control it and we can know it. But here is the truth. God doesn't want you to walk that walk of shame. God wants you to walk in a walk of freedom. My friends, you are not your mistakes. You are not a mistake. You are good. That is how God created you to be. And in Isaiah 28 and in Romans 10, it says, anyone who believes in Jesus will never be put to shame. You see, Jesus frees us from all of that shame so that you can break free of the lies that you have been told and bought into and believed. Because you are not what you did. You are not what they said to you. You are not what happened to you. You are not your mistakes. You are not your hurts. You are not your baggage. This is not for a second who you are or who God created you to be. You are a forgiven, complicated, beautiful, beloved child of God. And in Jesus, you were created good. You are loved and you are wanted and you are seen and your needs are not a problem. You are safe. You are not alone. You will be taken care of. You are important. You are completely 100% enough just as you are. So you get to live your life unashamed. And when we live unashamed, for most of us, we want other people to experience that freedom too. We don't use our freedom to create more problems for ourselves because we get what it feels like to have shame, but then we get what it feels like to take that shame off of us as well. So today, my hope and prayer is that you get to live into the reality of who God created you to be, God's beloved, good child. Take off that burden of shame and walk as a free child of God. But if you know someone today, someone who's struggling and wrestling with the shame of their own life, with the messages and lies that this world has put in on them, will you do me a favor? Will you share this message with them today? Help them to remember that in God, they were created good. And that is really what matters. Have a great day.